Glass was not new in the Middle Ages. The Romans were masters of it. They made incredible things. They could make clear glass, colored glass, and glass that looked like gemstones. They built huge factories and shipped their products all over the empire. Roman glass was everywhere. It was used for windows, cups, bowls, and jewelry. The knowledge was widespread. And then the Roman Empire fell apart. Things got chaotic. Long-distance trade broke down. The big centralized workshops disappeared, but the knowledge of glassmaking didn't vanish completely. It just scattered. It survived in smaller pockets, kept alive by craftsmen who passed the skills down through their families. The memory of Roman glass was like a long shadow. Medieval glassmakers lived in that shadow, trying to recreate something of what was lost. But they faced a big problem. They couldn't get the same ingredients. Roman glass was mostly soda lime glass. The key ingredient that helps melt the sand, the flux, was soda ash. This came from burning certain plants that grew near the Mediterranean coast. With the trade routes gone, a glassmaker in France or Germany couldn't get that soda ash anymore. They had to find a local substitute. They found it in the forest. They discovered that the ash from burned trees, especially beech trees, could also be used as a flux. This type of ash is called potash, so medieval glass in Northern Europe became a potash lime glass. This one changed to find everything about it. It was a different recipe born out of necessity. Because the main ingredients came from the forest, the glass workshops moved into the forest too. This is why it's often called forest glass, or walled glass in German. It was a practical decision. You needed immense amounts of wood. You needed wood to burn for the potash, and you needed even more wood to fuel the furnace, which had to stay hot 24 hours a day. It made no sense to haul tons of wood into a city. It was much easier to build your workshop right next to your fuel source. So, the three main ingredients for medieval forest glass were all local. First, there was sand. This provides the silica, the main body of the glass. It wasn't the pure white sand the Romans might have used. It was just sand dug up from a riverbank or a quarry. It was full of impurities, especially iron. This is the main reason forest glass has its characteristic color. The iron in the sand acted as a natural colorant, turning the finished glass a shade of green, yellow, or brownish green. They didn't see this as a flaw. It was just the nature of the material. The second ingredient was the flux. This was the potash, made from wood ash. Making it was a dirty, laborious job. Workers would gather huge piles of wood and burn them down to ash. Then they would run water through the ash to dissolve the useful alkali salts. They boiled this lye solution in big iron pots until the water evaporated, leaving behind a grayish, crude substance. This was the potash. Its job was to lower the melting temperature of the sand. Sand melts at a very high temperature, too high for a simple wood-fired furnace. The potash flux made it possible to turn solid sand into liquid glass at a manageable heat. The third ingredient was a stabilizer. Without it, the glass would be fragile and could even dissolve in water over time. The stabilizer was lime. It likely came from burned seashells, limestone, or sometimes even the ash itself contained enough of it. The lime made the final product strong and durable. It made the glass useful. Mixing these ingredients was more of an art than a science. There were no written formulas with precise measurements. A master glassmaker knew by feel, by experience. He would look at the quality of the sand, the strength of his potash, and decide on the right mix. The ingredients were mixed together and often preheated in a process called fritting. This burned off more impurities and started the chemical reaction before the mix went into the main melting pot. Sometimes they did add colors on purpose. It wasn't common for everyday drinking glasses, but for more important pieces or church windows, they knew how to do it. They used metal oxides, just as glassmakers do today. A little bit of cobalt from a ground-up rock could create a deep, brilliant blue. This copper could make a range of colors from green to a rich ruby red. Manganese was interesting. It could be used to create a purple color, but in small amounts it could also counteract the green from the iron impurities, making the glass clearer. They called it glassmaker's soap. So medieval glass was a product of its environment. It was tied to the deep forests of northern Europe. It was made from the earth, right under the glassmaker's feet and the trees growing all around him. Its greenish tint and its imperfections, like the little bubbles of air trapped inside, were not signs of failure. They were the honest signature of the materials available. It was a craft that had adapted and survived, changing its recipe to fit a new world. Imagine walking deep into a forest in medieval Germany or France. There are no proper roads, just muddy tracks. You smell wood smoke long before you see anything, then you come to a clearing, and in the middle of it stands a rough, shed-like building. This is the glass house. It's not a grand factory, it's a temporary, functional structure built to last only as long as the wood in the surrounding area held out. The glassmaking industry was nomadic. A team of glassmakers would get a license from a local lord to use a patch of forest. They would set up their workshop and work there for 10, maybe 20 years. In that time, they would clear the forest for miles around, felling trees for fuel and ash. When the wood was gone, they would abandon the old glass house, move on to a new patch of forest, and build another one. The forest floor in parts of Europe is still littered with the remains of these temporary workshops. The glass house itself was probably made of wood with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof. It was a fire hazard, and many of them burned down. Inside, the air was hot, thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood. The floor would be dirt, covered in ash and shards of broken glass. It was dark, with the only light coming from the door, a few small windows, and the glowing heart of the building, the furnace. The furnace was the center of everything. It was a massive structure, often built in the shape of a beehive, made from stone and clay. It was carefully designed to have different heat zones. A furnace was a major investment of time and labor to build, and it had to be kept burning continuously. Letting it cool down could cause the whole structure to crack. A team of laborers worked in shifts, day and night, just to feed logs into the firebox at the bottom. A typical furnace had 3 levels. At the very top was the annealing oven, called a leer. This was the coolest part. Finished glass pieces were placed here to cool down very slowly. Below that, at the main working level, were the openings into the hottest part of the furnace. This is where the melting pots, or crucibles, sat. These were large clay pots filled with the raw materials, where sand, potash, and lime were transformed into molten glass. There might be several of these openings, allowing multiple glass blowers to work at the same time. Below this main chamber was the firebox, the roaring fire that provided all the heat. Sometimes there was even a lower chamber used for fritting, the preheating of the ingredients. The work was organized in a strict hierarchy. At the top was the master glassblower. He was the most skilled craftsman, the one who knew the secrets of the trade. He didn't just blow glass, he managed the whole operation. He knew how to build the furnace, how to mix the ingredients, and how to create the most complex shapes. His knowledge was valuable, often passed down from father to son. Beneath the master were the journeymen and apprentices. These were skilled glassblowers, but still learning. They would do much of the basic work, preparing the glass and blowing simpler forms. An apprentice might start as a boy, doing simple tasks like carrying wood or cleaning up. Over many years, he would slowly learn the craft, moving up the ladder until he could become a master himself. It was a long, difficult apprenticeship. Then there were the laborers. These were the unskilled workers who did the backbreaking work. They cut down the trees, hauled the logs, tended the fire, and prepared the potash. Their work was essential. Without them, the furnace would go cold and the whole operation would stop. It was a team effort, and everyone had their role. Life in the glasshouse was hard. The heat was intense, especially in the summer. Burns were a constant danger. The air was filled with smoke and fumes. The work was physically demanding and went on for long hours. The tools they used were simple but effective. They have barely changed in over 1,000 years. The most important tool was the blowpipe. It was a hollow iron tube about 4 or 5 feet long. One end was for blowing and the other end was for gathering the molten glass from the pot. They also had a solid iron rod called a pontil, or punty. This was used to hold the glass piece by its base while the room was being finished. For shaping the glass, they had a few key tools. The marver was a flat slab of polished stone or iron where the initial gather of glass was rolled and shaped. They used various pincers and tong-like tools called pucellas to pinch, pull, and shape the hot glass. They had shears for cutting the glass, and they used wooden blocks, often kept wet, to help shape the body of a vessel. These few simple tools in the hands of a skilled worker were all that was needed to create a huge variety of objects. The forest glasshouse was a self-contained world. It was a place of intense heat, hard labor, and incredible skill. It was a community of workers living and working together in isolation, turning sand and ash into beautiful, useful objects through the power of fire and human breath. The process of making a glass vessel began at the mouth of the furnace. A glassblower, known as a gaffer, would take his blowpipe and approach the intense heat. The molten glass inside the crucible glowed with a bright orange light. It had the consistency of thick honey. The gaffer would dip the end of his blowpipe into the crucible and turn it slowly. A blob of molten glass, called a gather, would stick to the end. The first gather was usually small. The gaffer would pull it out of the furnace and take it to the marver. He would roll the hot glass on the flat, cool surface. This did two things. It cooled the outer layer of the glass just enough to create a skin, and it centered the gather on the end of the pipe, making it perfectly symmetrical. This was a critical first step. Then came the first breath. The gaffer would lift the pipe to his lips and blow a small, steady puff of air into it. A small bubble would appear inside the gather of glass. This was the beginning of the vessel. The magic of glass blowing is in this moment, turning a solid lump into a hollow form. But the glass cooled quickly. After a few seconds in the open air, it would become too stiff to work with. So the gaffer had to constantly return the piece to the furnace opening to reheat it. This opening was called the glory hole. He would stick the end of the pipe in, turning it constantly to heat the glass evenly. This cycle of heating, blowing, and shaping was repeated over and over. With each reheat, he could blow the bubble a little larger. He would swing the pipe to use gravity and centrifugal force to elongate the shape. He would let it hang down to make it longer, or spin it fast to make it wider. He controlled the shape through a combination of breath, movement, and simple tools. He might use a wet wooden block to smooth and shape the sides of a beaker. He might use his pucellas to create a constriction for the neck of a bottle. Once the main body of the vessel was formed, it was time for the tricky part. The vessel was attached to the blowpipe at its top, where the opening would be. But to finish that opening, to create a smooth rim, he had to free it from the pipe. This is where the Pontel rod came in. An assistant would bring the Pontel, which had a small gather of hot glass on its tip. He would carefully press this hot glass onto the center of the vessel's base. It would fuse instantly. Now, the vessel was held by the Pontel at its base. The gaffer could then break the vessel free from the blowpipe at the other end. He would score a line around the neck with the wet tool. A sharp tap would crack the glass cleanly along the line, leaving a rough, unfinished opening. With the vessel now held by the Pontel, the gaffer returned to the glory hole for another reheat. This time he was heating the opening. Once it was soft enough, he could finish the rim. He might use tools to flare it out, fold it over for strength, or just smooth it with a tool. This was also the stage where he could add things like handles or decorations. To add a handle, an assistant would bring a thin trail of hot glass from the furnace. The gaffer would attach this trail to the vessel and skillfully shape it into a handle with his tools before it cooled. A common decoration on forest glass was the prunt. These were small blobs of hot glass applied to the outside of a beaker. The gaffer would press a patterned stamp into the soft blob, creating a raspberry-like texture. These prunts were not just for looks. In an age before forks were common, hands were often greasy. The prunts provided a secure grip on the glass. The vessel was now complete, but the most dangerous part of its journey was still ahead. If it was left to cool in the open air, it would shatter. The outside would cool and shrink much faster than the inside, creating immense stress within the glass. To prevent this, the piece had to be annealed. The gaffer would give a sharp tap to the Pontel rod, breaking the vessel free. An assistant, using a forked stick, would quickly carry the finished piece and place it in the annealing oven, the leer. This was the warmest, but not hot, part of the furnace. Here, the glass could cool down very, very slowly over many hours, sometimes a full day. This slow cooling process allowed the internal stresses to even out, making the glass strong and stable. Every single piece of medieval hand-blown glass carries a telltale sign of this process. On the bottom, right in the center, there is a small, rough mark. This is the Pontel mark, or punty scar. It's the spot where the Pontel rod was broken off. In modern glass, this is often ground smooth. But in medieval glass, it was just left there. It's a small scar, a signature of the handmade process, a direct connection to the moment it was freed from the Pontel and placed in the leer to begin its life as a useful object. The products of the medieval glasshouse served all aspects of life, from the common tavern to the grand cathedral. The most common things they made were for everyday use. These were the humble, sturdy pieces of walled glass, the forest glass, with its typical greenish hue and charming imperfections. Drinking vessels were in high demand. One of the most common forms was a simple beaker, a straight-sided tumbler. But they also made more distinctive shapes. There was the Krautstrunk, which means cabbage stalk in German. It was a beaker covered in prickly prunts, making it look a bit like a stalk of kale. This was the glass you might see in a painting of a peasant feast. It was practical and hard to drop. Over time, this design evolved into the romer, a glass with a wide bowl, a thick hollow stem decorated with prunts, and a spun glass foot. The romer became the classic wine glass of Northern Europe for centuries. Another curious design was the Kutrolf. This was a bottle or flask with its neck divided into 2 or 3 intertwined tubes that reconnected at the top. When you poured a drink from it, the liquid would gurgle and splash. It was a sort of novelty, a trick glass that was fun to use. They also made passglaser or passing glasses. These were tall, cylindrical beakers with rings of glass applied around the outside at measured intervals. They were used in drinking games where each person had to drink down to the next ring. Besides drinking glasses, they made plenty of bottles and jars for storage. These were essential for keeping wine, oil, and other liquids safe. They also made glass for scientific and medical purposes. One of the most common items produced was the urinal. Doctors in the Middle Ages practiced uroscopy, the diagnosis of illness by examining the color, clarity, and even smell of a patient's urine. The glass urinal, with its flask-like shape, was a standard piece of medical equipment. It appears in countless medieval illustrations of doctors at work. Glass was also used for windows. But medieval window glass was not the perfectly flat, clear sheet we know today. They made it in two ways. The first was the crown glass method. A large bubble of glass was blown and then flattened into a disc by spinning the blowpipe rapidly. This created a circular pane of glass that was thinnest at the edges and had a thick lump, the bull's eye, in the center where the pontile was attached. These small circular panes were then cut up and pieced together with lead strips to make a window. The second method was the cylinder method. The glass blower would blow a very large long bubble, a cylinder shape. The ends of the cylinder were cut off. Then it was cut down one side. The cut cylinder was placed in an oven, where it would slowly unroll and flatten into a rectangular sheet. This sheet was more uneven and had more distortions than crown glass, but it could produce larger panes. For most ordinary houses, if they had glass windows at all, they were made from these small, imperfect panes pieced together. Light could come through, but the view would be wavy and blurred. This was one side of medieval glass production. It was functional, rustic, and served the daily needs of the people. But there was another side, one that reached for the heavens. This was the art of stained glass. The glass used for cathedral windows was different from forest glass. It was often made in workshops closer to the cities, with access to purer materials and the expensive metal oxides needed for vibrant colors. The goal here was not clarity, but color. Glassmakers created glass in every color imaginable. Deep cobalt blues, rich ruby reds, bright yellows, and emerald greens. They made these colors by adding metals to the molten glass: cobalt for blue, copper for red, silver for yellow, iron for green. The process of making the flat sheets was similar to the cylinder method. They knew that the slight variations in thickness and the occasional bubble in the glass would catch the light in beautiful ways. Once the sheets of colored glass were made, the artist took over. A master designer would draw a full-size plan for the window called a cartoon. The glass cutters would place the sheets of colored glass over this cartoon and cut out the required shapes. It was like putting together a giant complex puzzle. Then, painters would add details. Using a dark enamel made from ground glass, copper oxide, and a binder like wine or vinegar, they would paint faces, hands, and the folds of robes onto the pieces of glass. Then, the pieces were fired in a kiln. This fused the enamel permanently to the surface of the glass. Finally, the thousands of individual pieces were assembled. They were fitted into H-shaped strips of soft lead, called cames. The joints where the lead cames met were then soldered together to make the whole panel strong. These large panels were then installed high in the stone walls of the cathedrals. For the people of the Middle Ages, most of whom could not read, these windows were a Bible in light and color. They told the stories of their faith in a powerful, direct way. When the sun shone through a stained glass window, it transformed the interior of the church. The light was no longer ordinary. It was colored, jeweled, and divine. It was a glimpse of heaven on earth. So, from a simple green drinking cup to a magnificent rose window, medieval glass served both the body and the soul. The era of forest glass was not ended by a single event. It was a slow change, a shift in technology, taste, and economics that unfolded over a couple of centuries. The rustic, greenish glass made in the deep woods of Germany and France had dominated northern Europe for hundreds of years. It was a craft perfectly suited to its time and place, but the world was changing. The biggest challenge to the dominance of forest glass came from a city on the water, Venice. In the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, the glassmakers of Venice achieved something extraordinary. They had access to better raw materials. Instead of potash from wood ash, they used a purer soda ash derived from coastal plants. They also had access to clean white sand. By refining these ingredients, they rediscovered and perfected the art of making truly clear, colorless glass. They called it cristallo. Cristallo was unlike anything most Europeans had ever seen. It was light, delicate, and brilliant. It could be worked into incredibly thin and complex shapes. Venetian glassblowers created intricate goblets with elaborate stems, fantastically shaped vases, and delicate latticework patterns. This was a luxury product. It was elegant, refined, and sophisticated. It immediately became the most fashionable and desirable glass in all of Europe. Kings, princes, and wealthy merchants all wanted Venetian glass. Compared to Cristallo, the old forest glass suddenly looked clumsy and crude. Its greenish color, once just a natural feature, was now seen as an impurity. Its sturdy, practical form seemed old-fashioned next to the delicate fantasies of the Venetian masters. The aesthetic had changed. The goal was no longer just function, it was a demonstration of wealth and refined taste. The Venetians guarded their secrets fiercely. The glassmaking industry was moved to the island of Murano to prevent fires in the main city, but also to keep the glassmakers from leaving. They were well paid and respected, but they were also virtual prisoners. Leaving the island without permission could be punished by death. Despite these efforts, the secrets eventually got out. Venetian glassmakers, seeking better opportunities, escaped and set up workshops in other parts of Europe, bringing their superior techniques with them. This new style of glassmaking, Facon de Venise in the style of Venice, began to spread. Local workshops in places like Antwerp, London, and Prague started to produce their own clear soda lime glass. This was a direct threat to the traditional forest glass industry. At the same time, the world was running out of wood. Centuries of clearing land for farming, building cities, and fueling industries like glassmaking and iron smelting had led to massive deforestation. The very foundation of the forest glass tradition, the unlimited supply of wood, was disappearing. This forced another major technological shift, the switch from wood to coal as the primary fuel. And coal burned hotter than wood, but it also produced nasty fumes that could ruin the glass. This led to a new type of furnace design. The English developed the glass house cone in the 17th century. These were huge cone-shaped brick structures that acted as a giant chimney, drawing fresh air into the furnace and pulling the fumes away from the melting pots. They also started using covered melting pots to further protect the glass from impurities. This new technology broke the final link between glassmaking and the forest. With coal as fuel, a glass house no longer needed to be in the woods. It could be built in a city closer to markets and labor. The industry became urban and more centralized. The nomadic life of the forest glassmaker came to an end. The old walled glass tradition did not disappear overnight. It continued for a long time in rural areas, producing cheap bottles and common wares for local people. But it was no longer at the forefront of the craft. It had become a folk art, a relic of an older time. Looking back, it's easy to see medieval forest glass as inferior to the clear, perfect glass that came after it. But that's missing the point. It was a masterful adaptation to the resources and constraints of its time. Its beauty is not in its perfection, but in its honesty. You can see the hand of the maker in it. You can see the iron from the sand and the bubbles of air from the blower's breath. It tells a story of survival, of a craft that endured the collapse of an empire and found a new way to thrive in the heart of the forest. It was a glass made of wood ash and river sand, shaped by fire and breath, and used for the simple, essential acts of daily life.